Firstly, convert the equations into augmented matrix. Next, choose the most negative number from the last row, which is -6. This column is known as pivot column. After that, divide the constant which is in the last column with the number in pivot column. From that, choose the smallest number, which is 300. This row is called pivot row. Make the number in line with pivot column and pivot row, which is called pivot element, into 1. In this situation, our pivot element is now 2. In order to change pivot element into 1, we need to multiply row 2 with 1/2. Therefore, we will get a new row 2. The pivot column will become cleared, except for the pivot element which became 1 earlier. Therefore, we need to make the numbers other than pivot element in the pivot column into 0. In order to get the first row in the pivot column into 0, we need to multiply row 2 with -2 and add with row 1. Therefore, we will get a new row 1. To make the third row in the pivot column into 0, we need to multiply row 2 with -1 and add with row 3. Therefore, we will get a new row 3. To make the last row in the pivot column into 0, we need to multiply row 2 with 6 and add with row 4. Therefore, we will get a new row 4. After all the numbers in the pivot column become 0, except for the pivot element which is 1, variable z is going to replace the s2 as the basic variable in the second row. This is what we call as pivoting. Since there is another negative value in the last row, repeat step 1 to 5 until there is no more negative value. The only negative number in the last row is -1. Therefore, this column is called as pivot column. After that, divide the constant which is in the last column with the number in pivot column. From that, choose the smallest number and ignore negative value. Therefore, 100 is the smallest number and this row is called as pivot row. Since the number in line with pivot column and pivot row, which is called pivot element, already 1, we will continue to make the other number in the pivot column into 0. To make the second row in pivot column into 0, we need to multiply row 1 with -1/2 and add with row 2, and we will get a new row 2. To make the third row in pivot column into 0, we need to multiply row 1 with 1/2 and add with row 3. Then we will get a new row 3. Next, to make the last row in the pivot column into 0, we need to add row 4 with row 1. Then we will get a new row 4. The y variable is going to replace s1 as the basic variable in the first row. The other rows will retain their basic variable. Since there is no more negative value in the last row, the calculation is now complete. For conclusion, Alisto can receive maximum profit for 1,900 when 100 popular set and 250 grand set sold.